Thanks for listening to the Pharmacy Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Holistic Pharmacy Podcast. I'm your host, Marina Buksov, and I'm a functional medicine pharmacist in New York. I'm also a clinical herbalist and an integrative health coach specializing in mindfulness and empowerment. I'm on a mission to transform the way we approach healthcare by bridging the wisdom of traditional medicine with modern practice. And in this podcast, I will be highlighting guests who do just that. I'm constantly inspired by them, and I know you will be as well. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Holistic Pharmacy Podcast. I have another amazing guest with me on today. Her name is Mel Koppelman, and she's a program director at Synthesis Health Lab, and she's the go-to expert for people who've tried everything to heal their chronic illness, but keep hitting dead ends. By guiding her patients through a systematic 5-stage process, she helps patients achieve a 50% plus reduction in symptoms without endless supplements or constant lab testing. With 2 master's degrees and 15 years of clinical experience, Mel has pioneered a revolutionary approach that combines Chinese medicine, functional medicine, and developmental neurology. Her methods have helped thousands of patients recover from conditions like chronic fatigue, autoimmune disorders, and fibromyalgia when conventional and functional medicine failed. So Mel, very big welcome to the show here. And I'd love to start with the question I ask everybody, which is really how you started to do this work. Like, did you know that this is what was going to happen when you were growing up?
Yeah, so I think that when I was young, when I was little, there were early indications that I would end up going into the field of integrative medicine that I ended up falling in love with. You know, my mom was a physician. She was an endocrinologist, and she was also a medical researcher. And so I remember at a very early age playing with her doctor's kits with my dollies and helping them to get better. And I found out even quite recently that my grandmother was accepted to medical school after World War II in France, and ultimately she ended up not going because she didn't pass her physical because she had a heart murmur. But my grandfather was a chemist, and so I have a strong background in this area where I'm very interested in biochemistry. I'm very interested in living systems. But I think that seeing the experience that my mom went through, especially in the 1990s with a lot of insurance changes, enforcing really silly policies around how she could practice, I knew I didn't want to go into industrial medicine. And so I went a little bit of a different route. But after college, I traveled to India for 6 months where I was volunteering. And while I was there, I contracted amoebic dysentery, which I do not recommend. And I was quite ill, and I saw the inside of a couple of Delhi hospitals, but I was not given the treatment to prevent the chronic infection, and so I developed the chronic infection that I had for over 2 years. And when I came back to the United States, the medical system here, I just think they're not very familiar with that sort of tropical illness, and so they did not know how to test or treat for it. Period. So I kind of was left to my own devices, basically. And so that's when I discovered how helpful Chinese medicine can be, and also ended up really needing to learn a lot about nutrition, because there's a lot of opinions and dogma and different ideas around nutrition, what people should eat. But ultimately, because my digestion was so thoroughly trashed, I really needed to figure out, in reality, what I could do. So that ended up, inspiring me to go on to, I got a master's degree in Chinese medicine and acupuncture, and then a second master's in nutrition and functional medicine, which I have adored, being able to help people with problems that often they're told there is no help for. So that it's really very rewarding. But my path took a little bit of another twist 8 years ago when I had another health challenge. I woke up one morning and my whole system had crashed. I could barely function. And I had body-wide pain. I had no short-term memory. I had cognitive dysfunction, and just profound fatigue. I just needed to sit down and lie down whenever I could. And so, at that point, I already had a lot of tools, a lot of really useful frameworks for how to approach this, right? This is what I do for a living. And I already had quite a few years of experience. And so at first I was doing more of what I already knew. So I was running more labs on myself and finding more things to treat, usually with supplements, and doing all the things. And then at a certain point, maybe a year or two in, I had to admit to myself that this was not working. And it was very humbling. And I declared intellectual bankruptcy and sort of retrained, and just was voraciously hungry for what was true, what was real, that the things I had learned seemed to be partially true, right? And that they worked and helped sometimes. And I really wanted to know what are the accurate first principles, not based on opinion, but just empirically. And that led me to restudy Chinese medicine and Chinese herbs based on a classical understanding that's really rooted in the first principles of physics and nature. And then also to do a really deep dive on the nervous system, which I had no training in, but the nervous system is really the foundational system of the entire body. And I now have come to believe that you can't really interpret labs very well if you don't know how the brain works, So that's been very rewarding, because now I have a level of, kind of competence and desire when people have, super challenging histories. Now I have the tools and the frameworks that I know I can guide them.
Yeah, amazing. And I love your mission of being that person that people can turn to when they've tried everything else, and then having support systems or solutions for them based on your own understanding that you had to kind of learn the hard way, right? When something happens to yourself or a close loved one, this is usually when people start becoming sort of seekers and getting on different paths. And a lot of times we don't have those answers right away from allopathic sources or other nearby sources. So it prompts us to have to go on this hero's journey and learn it. And in your case, you had to keep learning and keep evolving. And it's kind of like a curse and a blessing at the same time, right? When you're going through a hard time, but it also is teaching you a lesson or helping you to evolve. So what would you say to somebody that may be struggling and maybe losing hope because they're just suffering and they haven't been able to seek those answers? They haven't found a practitioner that can sort of help them with everything. Maybe they've got partial relief, but they still have some lingering symptoms.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people out there like this. And I think that one of the most important skills in these times is discernment, because we have this explosion of information and products and tools and supplements and gadgets, and a lot of them are actually really quite helpful when they're used at the right time for the right person in the right way. It's, I use the metaphor of building a house a lot for various things, but, when we get so focused on the tool, it's like, I've got this amazing hammer. And it's like, well, that's not how you would approach a house renovation. That's crazy. But that is what happens. And one of the blessings is because I've been doing this long enough now, and I've seen so many trends come and go, then you get to be able to spot them. So at first, it's really exciting. It's like whatever, it's CBD, it's PEMF, it's, hydrogen water, any of these things. And again, these can be helpful. I'm not saying that, but you think that that's going to save the planet or everyone, or it's the missing key to everything. So once you've been around long enough and you can spot that, then it really becomes more of a case of, first of all, how is this really working? The challenges that I had, it was the perfect collection of problems to have in order to force me to learn things that I would not otherwise have had to learn. The skill set that I had before I was sick, I was still able to help a lot of people who hadn't been able to get better, but I was also still frustrated with my batting average. I wanted it to be just more reliable. And so, things like in my own system, which I think is true of probably about 30% of people with chronic illness, so it's not a small amount. That we talk a lot nowadays about chronic inflammation as being the cause of everyone's problems. But there are a lot of people who are actually underinflamed, and that's more their problem. So instead of being what I'd say stuck in the perpetual summer of inflammation. They're stuck in hibernation of winter. And that's not a small point, because a lot of the things that are recommended for most people are actually going to be counterproductive for these people. So this idea of discernment and being able to learn the frameworks to sort out what's likely going to be helpful, I think is really one of the most important skills that any of us need. And that's actually the one that I focus on teaching. So it's really not about me telling people what to do and giving them, these tools. It's more like, how do you figure out, how do you field in incoming information? With people that I'm working with, I want them to be seeing other practitioners. It's there's going to be a lot of help there, but now they understand about timing, or when the practitioner says something to them, like, yesterday someone said, oh, this chiropractor told me I need zinc, and I asked him why, and he said because it is important for 300 biochemical processes, and I was like, that's true, but we've got like 20,000 proteins. We've got 100,000 different conformations. I could start pulling out other micronutrients that I could say that about. So why zinc, right? And so it's like we all need to take these positive things that we've learned about how things from nature can be helpful, or actually are foundational, but then become a little more mature in our thinking and go, okay, right. Well, so vitamin C is good, but does that mean that everyone needs an IV full of it, or that's going to fix everything, right? That we can just get a little more discerning.
Yeah, I completely agree with you about the hot topics you mentioned, both with like the new technology and then also just using nutrients and supplements like, vitamin D, zinc, magnesium. And I do think a lot of us are deficient in those things. But yeah, I think we need to definitely be checking with the symptoms, with the labs. The labs are not perfect either. So it's kind of like both clinical and chemical that we have to gauge, and we have to test at the right times, and we have to look for optimal ranges and all these things that we learn about in the functional medicine side of things. And I'm curious if you can walk us through, if a patient comes to you looking for help, what is your process of walking them through, accepting them into your practice, and then also maybe what are the expectations as far as like timing and what you would do first, second, and third?
Sure. So these days I help people completely online in a group format, which I adore. And I was personally, as a practitioner and as a somewhat introverted person, a little bit skeptical of, although the research on the power and importance of groups is unequivocal in terms of healing. But I was trained to believe that you needed to have this one-on-one interaction. But what I found is that not only do people get better results in the group, but I'm actually able to give them more individualized attention in the group, ironically, than having, a 1 hour consult once every other month or whatever that would be in a functional medicine setting. And so folks come in, and actually you can apply to be a guest in the group for free. So as long as you're a good fit and what you are dealing with clinically is something that we work with, and that you seem like, I also try to protect the group in terms of people being nice people, being kind and being courteous and that sort of thing, because it's kind of important. It's the internet, but then you can come in completely for free, and you're in the group with the annual members. So you're seeing how I troubleshoot things with them in real time, how I guide them. You can ask me questions about your own case, and you get access to dozens of video lessons working with these different frameworks. So a lot of people will have fairly big epiphanies just kind of going through that section. And then if you choose to undergo a longer term process, then the program is given over a year. I could easily make it shorter in terms of the time that you get access to it, but I like giving people the opportunity to have that depth. Some people are coming in sick enough where they really do need that year to get to the next level. Other people, I could do it 6 months, but then they're getting kind of second and third level insights, which is really nice. And also success problems. So like, for example, there's a woman who came in, she'd had long COVID for 5 years now, and she used to be a marathon runner. And so she had POTS, so she had her heart rate was racing when she was standing up, and she had brain fog, and she had pain. And she's made a lot of progress in the front end of the program. But then she was starting to complain of some toe pain, But part of that was because she had so much more energy. She was walking around so much more. And it turned out that she had a fracture on that foot and a sprained ankle on that foot that wasn't healed properly. And so the toe pain was a success problem, because before the problem was she didn't have enough energy to move. And now that she has enough energy to move, now that she's coming out, and now we can handle that. So I like to have the opportunity for people to get to another level of functioning and well-being in their life, to come up with those things, so that they're learning how to think about these things.
I love that so much. Now, you talked about root causes, and with functional medicine, that's what we're always concerned about. And you mentioned inflammation is considered to be a big topic to tackle nowadays, that we're all attributing things to inflammation, but that's actually an intermediate, right, process where there's something behind that inflammation that's either triggering it or not allowing your own healing mechanisms to kick in, like you said, with the summer or winter type inflammation problems. And so I'm wondering if you can talk to us about like how you would assess for a person's root cause, right? Because we have all these diagnoses and these symptoms, but then how do we actually get to those root causes?
Yeah, sure. That's a really good question. The first thing that's really important, which I like that you said, is that we're talking about root causes, right? So there has been a tendency to try to find the root cause, which was a good step in the right direction based on not doing that and just suppressing symptoms. But most of the time, especially if someone's been, has a complex presentation where they have digestive issues and neurological issues and so on, there's likely going to be more than one thing. And having that frame a little bit more accurately oriented towards reality is helpful, because now we're not looking for like the one boogeyman to blame everything on and then getting disappointed and frustrated when that doesn't quote unquote work. And so part of it is really organizing people's journey in a step-by-step manner, where we're going through stages, and these stages are actually, it turns out that the body has a preferred order that it likes to heal in. And I know this is a little bit different than a lot of people learn in functional medicine land. I know that when I was primarily treating according to what I had learned in different functional medicine trainings, I was looking for an appropriate order of operations, because what would very frequently happen is someone would come see me, I'd run a bunch of labs, and I'd find a lot of things. And then there's a question, where do you start? And different people I trained with had very different answers to that. Some would say, start with hormones. Some would say, start with the gut. And I tried all those things for a very long time now, but I guess for me, it wasn't, it didn't seem to work well enough of the time. So in one case, we'd start with the gut, which is very common. As I got further into practice, I started attracting people with kind of more serious issues, or had been sick longer, had tried more things. A lot of them had come in already having spent a lot of time working on their gut. So they'd already done that. So then we had to figure out what to do next. And that hadn't really solved everything. And in my case, I'd also started with the gut. Starting with hormones also seemed like it made sense, and it could work, should work. And I was running labs and that sort of thing. And, I would say less than half of the time was that sort of the answer. And even when people felt better, it also seemed to cause other problems. But once I learned about using this order that I'm working with now, where it's really about where can you start that's the least likely to cause problems, and then it starts to the things that people have tried before start to make sense as to why they didn't work. And so I start with the immune system. I have found that the tools that I'm able to use from Chinese herbal medicine have certain strengths and certain sophistications where you can be a little bit more customized and a little bit more specific than I was able to achieve with lab-based supplementation, which I'm happy to go into, especially for your audience who tend to be pharmacists interested in herbalism and natural. I mean, there's a lot of richness here that I think some of your listeners might find mind-blowing. But we start with the immune system, which is really like the exterior of the body. So if you're renovating a house, if there's a leaky roof and smashed in windows and water's coming in, you're not going to start changing the carpets, and you're not going to start, doing the wiring. That's just the wrong order. So with the immune system, this is really about your exterior barriers to the outside world. And so even before the gut, is also, a very large exterior barrier in a sense. But when you are an animal walking around, your back and your skin are really more exterior than your gut. But also, it's, as I'm kind of describing it, this sounds like a little bit of like an intellectual conversation, but really it comes down to what happens when you treat this way, right? So we go in this order. We start with the immune system. We then work on the gut. We then work with the neuroendocrine system, which has been really interesting, in terms of what I've learned about that since I started. And then we work on tissue repair, which is like blood flow and old injuries and things like that. And I started to learn what happens when you go out of order. So for example, if someone has, let's say, fibromyalgia and like a lot of like muscle tension and pain, and they go for a massage, it's not uncommon for them to feel hungover the next day and to feel like a flare. And then it's once you understand the order, it starts to make sense that when the body has an infection, whether that's, it could be like a hidden pathogen or a chronic latent infection, it is trying to sequester it in tissues and it's trying to reduce circulation. So it's not wrong or stupid or bad to want to go for a massage, but then it just starts to make sense as to why you would think that would help, and yet it doesn't quite. Or in the case of the gut, people will spend a lot of time, many people, including myself, in my own developmental history, which we can go into, spent a whole lot of time focusing on the gut. And yet I still had autoantibodies. I still had inflammation no matter what I did, because the immune system really needed to be, retrained first. And sometimes the way we're trained, we kind of stick the immune system and the digestive system together. We say like things like 90% of the immune system's in the gut. And again, this isn't wrong, but it's not necessarily the most accurate map for working with the organism in front of us. And that actually, once I was able to back up a step and start, improving tolerance to my environment, the gut then just became very happy with what I was already doing. So I don't want this to be too much of an intellectual exercise. It really is where you learn by doing it, and each person learns by doing it.
Yeah, I love that. So what's step number 5?
Step number 5. So step number 5 is boosting. And that's where most people start. So our culture trains us that we're missing stuff that we need to go out and buy, and it's the same thing with our approach to the body. And I completely agree with the understanding that our soils are depleted and that people are on, eating all this food-like stuff and that we are missing nutrients, no doubt about it. But at the end of the day, there's a few things. One is that, these same people, including me in the past, have all this dysbiosis and craziness. And, the cells that we're made of are very similar to the single cells that we evolved from, that are 3 billion years old, and very similar to the single cells that overgrow when we don't want them to grow. And when we start taking things like iron and B12, they love it. It is like, there's a paper actually that talked about iron supplementation is like chocolate for dysbiotic bacteria. So it's not a question of whether or not there's truth to that perspective. It's really more about, again, going in order and really shifting the lens. Chinese medicine has, a 2,500-year-old history. So they've got billions of data points, and they have a maturity in terms of honing their clinical processes. And if you look at different times in Chinese history, there are times when you are mainly treating starving rice farmers, like they would need the supplementation, but then there were periods of time, like in the 1200s, when the diet was actually in some ways like our modern diet, lots of pizza and ice cream, and the approach was different, right? So the boosting phase is one that not everyone actually even needs to get to. That once you start off by removing the yucky stuff first, a lot of things will self-correct. But then if you still need to, or if you occasionally, it's usually less than 20% of the time, I will see someone, and even just by their body type and their history, that they are truly depleted. They have had ulcerative colitis for 20 years and they're like stick thin. That is a case that and that's the other point, is that this is not a rigid framework. This is really the order that we ask questions in, right? So it's not a protocol. It really is an approach, systematic approach to how we work through these things. But even, I get asked a lot about hormone supplementation and menopausal hormone replacement, and I'm happy to talk about that. But what I will say is that when you go through the first stages first of clearing out what shouldn't be there, of reversing hormone resistance that is part of inflammation, that you get the liver working better, then when you ask that question about hormone replacement, if the person wants to do it, it's often going to work a lot better, and they'll often need lower doses, as opposed to where I started, 15 years ago, starting off by testing hormones and giving them, and it's just maybe the right thing at the wrong time.
Wow, I am absolutely loving this order of operations, sort of like PEMDAS, right? And it just kind of makes sense. And I often say, there's more than one way to heal, but I think this systematic approach is so helpful, especially when it's backed by experience and you noticing like what happens when you do go out of order. It just may extend the time necessary. You may have to kind of go back and forth and backtrack. And that's certainly not ideal when somebody is suffering a lot and want improvement right away. So I am curious about labs, which we've been mentioning already. How important is it for somebody to look at their lab work right away? At what point do you assess it? Is it really necessary? There's like a lot of different methodologies about test, don't guess, and other different controversies. And obviously in Chinese medicine, they didn't have labs to go on, so they would just read the body in other ways. So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I will share my opinion. It may be controversial. It is very hard one. So I started off with test don't guess with Reed Davis. I went on to get a master's degree in functional medicine. I've done a lot of additional training, including year-long mentorships. For a while I was running like Genova's ION panel of 250 nutrient-based markers, and then I was deep diving on PubMed. This is when I was sick, my brain wasn't working, and I was like, I need to figure this out or I'm going to die trying. And I was convinced I was going to like map out all the pathways. Like, I had a multi-supplement that was made from my own genetic SNPs. I was into it, and I actually even gave a talk probably over 10 years ago at a Chinese medicine conference saying that if the Yellow Emperor, who is like the ancient 2,500-year-old guy who wrote a lot of the classical texts, if he had had labs, he would have used them. That was like one of my talks. And my pendulum has swung a little bit on labs, and it's for several reasons. One is that the way that labs are interpreted, even in functional medicine, are more often misinterpreted than they are interpreted accurately. And it's everyone's, people are well-intentioned and they're very intelligent, and it's not saying what they think it is saying. And even when I was in one of these year-long mentorships and I was asking questions that the person couldn't answer, but it's like, it's okay not to know everything, but it's like, how are they thinking about it? Or what are their assumptions? Or what are they doing with the fact that they don't understand it? But there was so many gaps. But I can give you some examples, well, let me give you some, what are some examples? Okay, here's a good example. So mercury testing, right? So as part of my history, when I had dysentery and I could barely eat anything, one thing that I could very happily eat all day long was fish. So I blithely and happily gave myself a crazy off the charts mercury issue on top of everything else. And I used the Quicksilver Try test, which is an excellent lab if you're going to test for mercury, and was able to get some of that stuff out. But many people don't realize that body burden of mercury, which is only testable in autopsy, has no correlation, zero correlation to the levels of mercury in your blood, in your hair, or in your urine. And this is because mercury is very toxic, and so the body is working very hard to excrete it, and if it can't excrete it, is to sequester it into tissues that you are not measuring. Which is not to say to never run the lab, is to be aware of what you are testing and what you can tell from a test and what you can't tell from a test. And there are so many examples like this, where, well, I don't know, like that a lot of people are doing hair mineral analysis, and that the interpretations may have improved from when I looked at that in the past, but a lot of times they were measuring things and taking them on face value. But when you have something like calcium, hair calcium has an inverse relationship to calcium in the coronary arteries, right? So, high, low, it's like this whole thing, if it's low, they're giving more calcium. I mean, there's so many examples. When you look at reference ranges for men and women should be different, and they very rarely are. And so if you're misinterpreting, most of the time, it goes on and on. So what I've come to after completely walking away, going completely crazy, trying to interpret all these biochemical pathways and follow the tryptophan pathway from sun exposure and how it turns into serotonin and melatonin and driving myself mad. I still use labs. I keep them at arm's length, and I very rarely need to use them in order to get someone better. What they're more used for is someone comes in with them. I say, great, this is interesting. And then we go through the process, and then I'm like, yeah, you want to retest? And they look better. Which is kind of a dream come true and a long way from where I started, which was this, humans have a normal innate desire for certainty, and labs provide that, even if that certainty is misfounded. And so by being able to treat more according to what we can see, what I call at the organism level, right, where we kind of zoom out and be able to interpret things more based on like a bedside clinical exam, we can then use the lab data as part of that to triangulate that. But what I found, and again, having 15 years in, is that I know in functional medicine we say that it's patient-centered and we treat the person. In practice, it is very hard to not focus on the lab data, and that is when I see people who have been through that route and I see how many supplements they're on and whatever it is very difficult not to do that. So I use labs. I can interpret them. They are sometimes helpful. They have been helpful for me, but if I had been using them as a primary tool guiding what I was doing clinically, I would still be very sick.
Yeah, thank you so much for that perspective. I think there's just so many opinions out there, and it's so interesting to hear all the different approaches. And I completely agree with you that we tend to over intellectualize, and that's where conventional medicine is getting it wrong sometimes, right? Where it may be so helpful in the acute setting, but when you're trying to really go into the root causes of chronic illness, there's just so many factors that the labs can not give us the full picture, even if we're trying to test everything. So we really need to use so many more tools, even if we're using the labs. And yeah, it just tends not to happen when we focus on that. So
and actually, just to provide like another, I don't know, because it's one thing to say this way is problematic, but then it's like, well, what do we do instead? And so I want to share a little bit of kind of where I ended up, which was really, I don't know, for me, I think it's fascinating, right? Is that, so a lot of the way we use labs is kind of comes from old school lab testing where we just didn't have that many markers. And a lot of those markers are still very helpful, by the way. But what we're now moving into, and actually we've been there for a few years, is in the age of metabolomics, right? Where you can basically, add an agent and then measure how everything changes. When you measure how everything changes at once, so not one marker or two markers, but all the markers, what you're really looking at is a global shift in metabolism. And when you're doing that, you're getting back to what I referred to before with the cell danger response of summer metabolism or winter metabolism. If you have big summer metabolism, that's inflammation, and you can also go into a hypometabolic state, right? So that's everything shifting at once. Well, it turns out that that's actually what the ancient Chinese herbalists were talking about when they talked about cold and hot. So we go back full circle. So now we have this like beautiful pharmacopoeia of these formulas that have been used for millennia, that we really know how they work. And we can work on that level. And is it ever relevant that someone has a SNP? Maybe. There are genetic diseases. There are always examples, right? There are examples of true iron deficiency, but they don't present all the time in a functional medicine lab practice, right? So if we start off by understanding things like hot and cold, damp and dry, which is exactly what the metabolomics data shows, and we have all these tools that we can use to interface with that, this is higher leverage because you're looking at the global state. You're not over focusing prematurely. So the example I would give is like, if we're looking at trying to grow a garden and we look outside, what do we want to know? We want to know, like, where is the sun coming over throughout the day? What is the average rainfall? What does the drainage look like? Now, could I go in and do a soil sample and test for the minerals in there? Absolutely. Would that be helpful? Sure. But what if I mainly only did that? What if I mainly just took this soil sample, I kind of listened a little bit about the history of the property, and then tried planting just according to that? It's not going to go well, right? So this is it, is that this is what I mean by arm's length, is that it's probably more important where the sun's going and where the drainage is than the exact percentage of phosphate in that soil, and just making sure that we're flexible in our frameworks so that we can use the appropriate lens for the appropriate situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of my students, that when we talk about energetics, it can be really confusing because we don't tend to learn that way based on the foundational principles, like you were mentioning earlier, with just the laws of the universe and physics and the power of observation and perception. But that's really where science did originate, kind of just noticing the qualities, noticing the patterns. And they really tell us about what's happening on this micromolecular level when we observe it in other ways. And now that we just got so good at going micro and we have the tools to go there, it sometimes doesn't let us, see the forest from the trees kind of thing. So I think it's so wonderful that you're combining all of those things and integrating them. And using that framework, and then using your clinical approach and understanding where you can implement each, which I think that's the missing thing. When we have like a rigid protocol or a guideline that we follow, we sometimes forget the art, right? And we just focus strictly on going step by step. So I wanted to ask you, since we're talking about controversial things, there's a lot of different opinions also about detoxification. So what do you think we're getting wrong there?
Great question. I think part of the problem is when we're applying any lens like that to everyone. It's like it's a partial story that has enough truth to it, right? Like, are we toxic? Sure. Like I agree, right? But I also remember a time when like that was everyone's problem and that was what we needed to do. And it just doesn't account for reality, for really, where do we need to start and where do we need to go? And it may, also there's perhaps some other stories that seep into that, like a kind of original sin, kind of Christian story of like, we are dirty, we must purge ourselves, that also can get into it. I mean, I've had plenty of patients who get a little bit addicted to detoxification. So I think it's like all of these things that, I've come to realize that, none of these ideas are bad or wrong. A lot of them are good, but we can take them to a little bit absurd conclusions. And I think as well, when, if we focus again a little bit too much on the molecular, we can run into problems. Like one teacher I have was showing me that it's something like milk thistle, which is everyone loves to use for detoxification, actually has sort of opposite effects intracellularly, where it actually slows down detoxification. Now, I would call that a reversal, right? Where you're like, you learned something does one thing, and then you learn where it does the opposite. Reversals, this is part of the reason why I've kind of come to where I am, started happening for me all the time, that everything that I learned was suddenly having a reversal. And that's where I realized that the problem was not with the facts or the details. The problem was with the approach that, functional medicine's lineage is coming off of industrial medicine, and it is an improvement, but it is a very short lineage. We do not actually have really good research for how most people practice in reality. And so when you understand first principles never change. They are true whether you acknowledge them or not. And then it allows you to apply them and spot exceptions so that you don't have all these reversals, because you anticipate them. Because you understand how things are working, when the exception's about to happen. And it's a totally different ballgame.
Yeah, thank you so much for that perspective. And I think what you're speaking to also is like efficiency, right? So we talked about how all roads lead to Rome, like, you can achieve healing in different ways, but it's like when we're talking about like healthcare resources, right? And people's money and people's time, this is when sometimes the ancient traditions that have so much history and depth to them can be the more cost, time, and labor effective option. And so I tend to also start there before we have to bring out the big guns. But at the same time, you have to see what the situation is and make a clinical judgment at that point. But I so appreciate all the wisdom that you've been dropping so far, Mel. And we're coming to the end of the podcast, but I wanted to talk for a minute about our professionals, our practitioners that are listening. And I wanted to see if you could look back on your journey and kind of see the road you took, all the degrees, all the training. Do you see another way that you would have gone back and got a different degree? Would you have become an MD, or like, what would you recommend as that fastest, most efficient path for people that are looking to get into this integrative work and the model that you've been sharing?
Oh, that's a great question. There was a time when I wished I could be an MD, or just really more so I could kind of navigate the system. I'm so grateful that I never became an MD, not because I don't admire MDs and what they do, but they don't learn how the body works. So if I had gone through that training, I would be pissed. That there's a lot of skills that they do get, but there's other skills that they're missing. And there's other problems. There's a lot of fear-based to it, and so on. I think maybe things are changing, but really a lot of the training is coming from the pharmaceutical industry, and it really gives a very singular way of looking at things. No, I think if I were to go back and do it again, I would start where I ended up, which is studying Neijing nature-based medicine with my teacher, Ed Neal, and who's a fascinating, beautiful person. He's an MD. He was an emergency room physician. And then he ended up studying Chinese medicine and realizing a lot of the stories that we were taught in Chinese medicine didn't really kind of make sense or match up. So he ended up spending 20 years translating the Neijing, which is our original source document for all of Chinese medicine, and realizing that it actually says something quite different than what most acupuncturists and Chinese medicine practitioners are taught, and that when you apply it, the messages in there, the way they are written, your efficacy kind of jumps up. And has, he talks about giving a new story for cancer, and he treats cancer kind of in the opposite way that a lot of people do. And again, with his MD license on the line, so he's been able to help people with very advanced cancer reverse and that sort of thing. So I would start learning with him, because what he is teaching is a lifelong learning. It's not like a degree, a piece of paper that you get, it's learning how to see in a completely different way. And then the neurology is also similarly a lifelong learning, so I'm have some amazing teachers there, both on developmental neurology, which I would love like that to be a core skill for doctors and pediatricians and teachers and OTs. It's just, or even like in the field of psychiatry, if you look at the diagnostic criteria, none of them mention the brain, so it's like, and I'm not a materialist, but the brain's relevant, for that conversation. We don't want to leave it out completely, So a lot of people have issues, even if that does come from trauma or attachment wounds or even those sorts of things. We still need to understand what the brain's doing. Often that is an entry point. And just also through that lens that we can get a tremendous amount of information, really just by inquiring into the person's body. We spoke a moment ago about how labs are used. And, it wasn't that long ago in industrial medicine that doctors were really doing a lot more bedside examination, and they were just using the labs again to get additional information. And then it really kept going more and more in this direction, to the point where I feel like doctors are kind of conditioned to be afraid of having an opinion without having a scan or the data. Like they're conditioned not to get that information just by looking at the level of distress of the person in front of them, or their complexion, or things like that. So I think those two things that I'm studying now, I'm along with the Chinese herbal medicine, will set me up for the rest of my life in terms of just going deeper and deeper into those. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in any of those things to dive in, because I will say that I've been fortunate enough to have found some amazing teachers that I'm looking forward to learning from for the rest of my days.
Amazing. Thank you so much again for such a fascinating conversation. And I think it just brings to the forefront of the body not just being a bunch of biochemical soup equations that we solve for, and like whether you view the body as like an animated soul, life force energy in a body versus just a machine that we can, kind of just oil and rig here and there. That makes all the difference. So Mel, do you have one more minute to go into our rapid fire round of questions?
Sure.
Okay. Beautiful. So the first question is, what's the number one thing you recommend for somebody to improve their quality of life right now?
For most people, it's to figure out what they have that they don't need to get rid of. It's usually faster and more efficient, whether that is a commitment or an object that's collecting dust or something that they're taking, you can usually start off by simplifying and clearing, and then if you need to add, you can add after.
Yes. Such a confusing world out there where we don't have enough simplicity. So I love that. Okay, question 2, was there anything that most surprised you about your journey that we've been talking about in this episode?
I think that the neurology piece, it's amazing how all of the things that people can do even when their brain is somewhat broken, that always amazes me. And also just what you can learn by just watching someone walk. For me, like if I find myself in an airport, it's like my new guilty pleasure, just watching people walk, and I can tell all sorts of things about them, including their personality and their brain function. So that surprised me, but it's also kind of a fun party trick.
Wow, amazing. I have to try that. So finally, I would love for you to share about a fun hobby or any new projects or anything else that you want to share about yourself.
Yeah. So my family recently moved to a different area of our state here in Rhode Island, and we've got a daughter who's just turning 6. And so I'm enjoying learning how to do new things along with her. So that has involved things like rock climbing that I hadn't done before, skiing that I hadn't done before, camping that I hadn't done too much. So I'm kind of enjoying being in the beginner's mind and trying to get my competency up a little bit faster so I can also teach her safely and enjoyably. But those are the things I'm enjoying at the moment, is like kind of learning how to do the things that I want to help bring into her experience.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I think when we have kids, it's an opportunity to relive one's own childhood, because you're kind of reliving all those life phases along with them. And even if you don't have your own kids, if you have kids in your life, that also just gives you that chance to be, their aunt or, whoever that gets to relive those little pieces. So I think that's wonderful. So Mel, if somebody is local, can they contact you, or do you practice online? Tell us the best way that listeners can get in touch.
Yeah, sure. My local practice is very limited, so it's mainly existing patients for the most part. But where I am seeing people is online. I have a group of people all over the world who are going through step-by-step process to reverse complex chronic illness. It is free to apply to that group. I also have a practitioner group, which I don't mention as often, really for popular demand, that people wanted to learn how to do this. And in that group, I usually want the practitioner themselves to also go through the process. A lot of us are walking wounded and wounded healers. And it's the best way to learn. It's the best way to learn all the psychological things, all the things that we tell patients to do and that we don't do ourselves. And we want to become aware of those internal drivers, and then we can level up our leadership. Again, this is all personal experience. So these are set up to keep to a high standard, but it's free to apply to either of those groups. And to be a guest for a period of time, so you can see how we do things. You can see how I guide people in real time. And then if you want to enter kind of a long-term mentorship relationship, then there's that opportunity as well.
Wow, so wonderful. I will take a look myself, and I hope others listening will take advantage of this generosity. Thank you so much, Mel, for this episode, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Holistic Pharmacy Podcast, and I truly hope you enjoyed the show. If you learned something useful in this episode, please consider giving the show a 5-star rating and a sincere review so that more people can find it, or share it with a friend directly. To get in touch with me, you can find me on social media by looking up my name, Marina Buksov, or email me at marina@rawfork.com. Take good care and see you soon.